of the Institute on National Affairs, and I would like to welcome all of you here on behalf of our Planning Committee of Students and Faculty. Before we begin, I would also like to point out the George Washington Carver exhibit over there, which will be on display throughout the week and which has been brought to us through the support of the Iowa Humanities Board, the ISU Alumni Association, the government of the student body, and the George Washington Carver Steering Committee. It will be touring the state in celebration of the centennial of Carver's enrollment here as the first African American student and faculty member. This year's institute is dedicated to George Washington Carver's life and work. And now here's Marlena.
Good evening. The statement of purpose for the 1991 Institute on National Affairs, Higher Education and a Democracy, states the following, and this is just a portion of it. Perhaps the most precious gift that Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement gave to America was the enlargement of democracy. Following the example of African Americans, countless other groups found a voice and took their rightful place in the political dialogue of this nation. I think it is appropriate to associate the enlargement of democracy with Martin Luther King and with the Civil Rights Movement. But prior to the 60s, there are others paving the way, enlightening, building a legacy. One of those individuals was George Washington Carver. The dedication of this institute to his life and work in the centennial year of his enrollment as the first African American student at Iowa State University, I think serves to highlight the significance of his contribution to this university and to the academic community. Our lecturer this evening is what I would call an authority on George Washington Carver. Dr. McMurray, Linda McMurray, is a professor of African American Studies at North Carolina State University at Raleigh. She did her doctoral dissertation on George Washington Carver. It was entitled Background to Fame, The Career of George Washington Carver, 1896-1916. She has also written a book on George Washington Carver entitled George Washington Carver, Scientist and Symbol. And without anything else, I'd like to introduce to you our lecturer, Dr. Linda O. McMurray.
My topic is George Washington Carver, making education common. And I have a tendency when I'm speaking about Carver to get carried away because I find the man fascinating. So I'm going to try to stick basically to a prepared talk and leave, I hope, some time for questions and comments and so forth afterwards. George Washington Carver was a man who captured the imagination of the American people. The romance of his life story and the eccentricities of his personality led to his becoming a kind of folk saint, both in his lifetime and beyond. He was readily appropriated by many diverse groups for a myriad of causes. To Southern businessmen, Carver was an incarnation of the New South philosophy. Religious leaders embraced the scientists' proclaimed reliance upon God as an inspirational source in an age of materialism. There were also those who were struggling through the Depression saw Carver as a living Horatio Alger hero whose story offered hope of success for those who tried hard enough. To people concerned with race relations, Carver's career was either proof of the ability and intelligence of African Americans or an indication that slavery and segregation couldn't be too bad if it produced a Carver. Regardless of the cause, segments of his life and personality were often highlighted and embellished in order to prove a point. Therefore, separating the real George Washington Carver from the symbolic portrayals of his life are difficult. Reality and mythology became blurred even within Carver's own mind, and his life did have mythical qualities. Yet Carver was more than a folk saint. He was a real person with all the complexities and contradictions that are inherent in human nature. And these were exaggerated by his being black in white America. In the end, he won international fame for his efforts at finding commercial usages for southern resources such as peanuts, and was proclaimed one of the world's greatest chemists. For a variety of reasons, both the value of his discoveries and the significance of his role in revolutionizing the Southern economy were considerably inflated. Actually, Carver did not assume the role of creative chemist until relatively late in life. From early childhood on, Carver and everybody that came in contact with him was aware that he possessed rare and unusual talents. And he believed that these talents had been given him for some special mission, and spent a good portion of his life trying to find that special mission. Had Carver been white, his choice of careers would probably have been different. If he had placed his own personal desires above a sense of responsibility toward his fellow African Americans, he most likely would have become either an artist or a botanist engaged in plant breeding or mycological research. These were the areas in which he excelled both at Simpson College and here at Iowa State. When he accepted Booker T. Washington's offer to come to Tuskegee in 1896, however, he unknowingly sacrificed those career alternatives. For almost 20 years, Carver remained in the shadow of Washington at Tuskegee, devoting his life to a career of agricultural research and education. When Washington died in 1915, Carver was in his 50s and had already made many of what I consider his most significant contributions, which were aimed at improving the life of impoverished sharecroppers. But he was still largely unknown and dissatisfied with his life. To some degree, this sense of failure was what propelled Carver toward the role of creative chemist, as he later became known, and international fame after Washington's death. Myth-making accelerated with Carver's rise to prominence and produced the Carver legend. As a result, he became the Peanut Man, a stereotype of an accommodationist achiever that served many symbolic needs. Not only were his weaknesses and failures obscured, but also much of the significance of his vision and his work. Some historians have measured Carver by the legends and have declared him a fraud. In 1976, Barry McIntosh wrote an article for the Journal of Southern History entitled "George Washington Carver, The Making of a Myth." In it, he systematically dismissed every one of Carver's claims to fame and every accomplishment Carver ever made. He even quoted from one letter, out of context, I must say, to attack Carver as a teacher. McIntosh basically asserts that Carver was made famous by whites, largely because he, quote, epitomized submission and piety, unquote, which were qualities whites desired in African Americans. McIntosh, however, makes a serious mistake, I believe, by focusing entirely on all the things Carver was not, and in many cases things that Carver was not even attempting to be. McIntosh therefore misses what Carver actually was. Even subtracting all the things that Carver was not still leaves plenty about the man to admire and celebrate, and even make his alma mater proud. One reason that McIntosh got such a distorted view of Carver was that he relied mainly on the Booker T. Washington papers for his information. And one thing Carver was not was compatible with Booker T. Washington. The two men shared a great mutual respect for one another, but they also had strong personalities that clashed on a regular basis. Washington was particularly disappointed in Carver's seeming lack of total lack of administrative abilities. Their relationship was stormy and marked by repeated exchanges of resignation threats and ultimatums. And this is what McIntosh was relying on, these documents, you might say. But at the height of one of their battles, Booker T. Washington wrote a letter that aired a long list of grievances against Carver, but also noted, "You are a great teacher, a great lecturer, a great inspirer of young men and old men." Washington listed other strengths held by Carver, but today I want to focus on Carver the teacher, the inspirer of young men and old men. Carver's educational background and personality interacted with the conditions that he found in rural Alabama to produce a philosophy and method of teaching that truly met Booker T. Washington's goal of making education common. Washington frequently used that term, making education common, to describe education geared to the needs of the masses. The term also referred to the need to make instruction appropriate to the intended audience. In a number of settings, with the diverse types of students, George Washington Carver displayed a rare gift for making education common. He certainly understood the hardships that poor African Americans faced in acquiring an education. He personally spent over a dozen years wandering through the Midwest seeking education. Yet when he enrolled at Simpson College in 1890, he was about 25 years old and did not have the equivalent of a high school degree. Yet when he transferred to Iowa State in 1891, Carver was an outstanding student. Once again, he impressed the people around him with his unusual talents and gifts. The school's leading expert in mycology, or the study of fungi, called Carver the best collector I ever had in the department or have ever known. Another faculty member noted, "In cross-fertilization and the propagation of plants, Carver is by all means the ablest student we have here. Except for the respect that I owe the professors, I would say he's fully abreast of them and exceeds in special lines in which he has taste." Because of his outstanding abilities, Carver was asked to pursue postgraduate work here at Iowa State and was employed to be in charge of the greenhouse and to teach freshman botany. Apparently, from the very beginning, Carver displayed a gift for teaching. As a botany assistant, Carver won the respect and admiration of his white pupils. One of his students, who later became a professor in the College of Agriculture at the University of Wisconsin, wrote a letter of gratitude in 1941. He thanked Carver for interesting him in botany and noted that he seldom saw a certain plant without thinking of Carver. In 1948, the same student declared that Carver was his best teacher and one who displayed an unusual gift for guiding students to discover things for themselves rather than telling them everything. Carver's ability to inspire and instruct was extended beyond the students under his immediate charge at Iowa State. One of the professors, Henry C. Wallace, had a precocious 6-year-old son named Henry A. Wallace. Carver allowed the young Wallace to go with him in his rambles through the woods and shared with the boy the mysteries of nature. Wallace, who later became renowned for his plant breeding and for his service as Secretary of Agriculture and Vice President under Franklin D. Roosevelt, credited Carver with giving him his first and lifelong interest in plants. He called Carver the kindliest, most patient teacher I ever knew, and declared he could cause a little boy to see the things which he saw in a grass flower. When Carver arrived on the Tuskegee campus in 1896, he was armed with an advanced degree from one of the nation's leading agricultural colleges and with teaching experience. He quickly learned, however, that Tuskegee Normal and Industrial Institute was not Iowa State. Iowa State was a college and accepted only high school graduates. Tuskegee students ranged from the 5th grade through high school, and many were barely literate. Carver's curriculum at Iowa State was heavily weighted in the sciences and in theory courses. Booker T. Washington believed academic classroom work should be of secondary, supportive nature to the actual practice of a vocation. In Washington's educational schemes, the students were not only to get experience in their trade or vocation, but their work was to actually supply the physical needs of the school. After the Civil War, African Americans in the South were eager to taste the forbidden fruit of education. They made incredible sacrifices to educate themselves and their children. The more gifted and fortunate could and did benefit from higher education. But many were so enmeshed in poverty and ignorance that they had to be taught basic survival skills first. The teaching methods used at Iowa State were hardly appropriate for this task, and it is a measure of Carver's greatness as a teacher that he was able to be as effective under conditions at Tuskegee as he had been at Iowa State. Numerous elements of Carver's personality combined to make him a tremendously effective educator and speaker. He did not possess polished oratorical skills. In fact, his voice was often described as high-pitched and squeaky. But he did have a highly developed sense of showmanship. He usually spoke in a plain, conversational tone, and in both his public lectures and in the classroom. And he usually sprinkled his talks with subdued humor and understated dramatic examples. The impact of his speaking techniques was often incredible. One listener vowed, "You are the most seductive being I know, capable of making yourself loved by all the world when you choose." At the heart of Carver's success was his enthusiasm for his subject and a rather unique perspective on that subject. Whether the course was labeled botany, chemistry, or agriculture, what Carver taught was an appreciation of the miracles and beauties of nature. To Carver, the great creative forces of the universe were divine in origin, and people who attuned themselves to these forces could harness their power and become agents for the creation of the miraculous. To study agriculture was to study one means of harnessing the forces of nature for the benefits of human beings. Carver's lectures on even the most mundane subject became religious as well as educational experiences. In Carver's philosophy, nature was a great teacher. An understanding and appreciation of natural phenomena and forces led one to a clearer perception of all great truths. Nothing existed in a vacuum to Carver. Everything was an integral part of the great whole. Therefore, when a student really understood one phenomenon, he could easily be led to understand all related phenomena. Learning, Carver stressed, should be structured to lead a student from what he already knew to the nearest related unknown. Matter of fact, he defined education as the process of understanding relationships. Carver believed the best means for teaching relationships was what he called the group method, by which students were not taught abstract precepts of the various sciences in isolation. Instead, one particular object, like the cowpea, was studied in depth, and the student was shown how the various natural forces, which were usually taught separately in chemistry, meteorology, botany, entomology, and such courses, came together in the production of a single plant. He believed when a student thoroughly understood the processes that created a cowpea, he could readily grasp how those forces affected other phenomena. His approach to teaching displayed Carver's self-ordained role as a generalist in an age of specialization. Such an approach was highly effective in meeting the needs of the average Tuskegee student. Another ingredient in Carver's teaching formula, which increased his effectiveness, was his belief that a student could more readily understand what could be seen and touched than an abstract idea. Every day before breakfast, Carver went out rambling in the woods and fields. On these trips, he declared, he communed with his creator. He also collected specimens of plants, fungi, and minerals, which are often used as classroom examples. In his lectures, he used these and other physical objects to illustrate natural processes. For example, the roots of the cowpea were used to explain nitrogen fixation. While this kind of crop was fairly obvious, Carver often used intriguing objects to convey abstract ideas and values. One of the key ideas in Carver's philosophy was that nature produced no waste. Instead, what many called waste products resulted from the failure of human beings to apply their intelligence to the use of natural resources. To illustrate this idea, Carver sometimes displayed a mass of tangled, knotted string that had been thrown away as useless. He would then produce another batch of old string which had been neatly tied and rewound, able to be used again for its original purposes. Ignorance, Carver would declare, was like the tangled mass of string, while intelligence brought order and usefulness. Carver also believed that the best teacher was a guide rather than a dispenser of knowledge. Students should be inspired to learn on their own by actively engaging in the educational process. Learning this way became a lifelong adventure. His botany classes competed against one another in collecting specimens of species within a specific generic family. Students were encouraged to conduct experiments and engage in special projects on their own. Some, like Thomason Campbell, took up Carver's challenges with enthusiasm. Campbell, who later became the first black agricultural demonstration agent employed by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, used his spare time to put together a hog skeleton for the Agricultural Museum. One activity that Carver especially urged was the collecting and identifying of various kinds of specimens, because he wanted students to observe and to learn from the things around them. Students often brought their specimens to Carver for identification and explanation, and they were continuously astonished at the breadth of his knowledge. It became a kind of game to stump the professor. Finally, one group of boys decided to trick Carver by constructing a new species of insect from miscellaneous parts of various bugs. To their delighted dismay, the professor quickly, correctly identified it. He pronounced it a humbug. Above all else, Carver's own reverence for the miracles of nature inspired students. Things once taken for granted became exciting and miraculous when explained by Carver. On botany hikes, students listened not only to generic identifications, but also to recitations of Greek poetry. His enthusiasm was genuine and infectious. He once organized an all-night vigil to witness the flowering of a rare blooming plant. His message was clear. Beauty and meaning are within the reach of even the most impoverished. The effectiveness of Carver's classroom techniques led Washington to frequently call upon him to lecture to his fellow teachers on how to improve their teaching methods. Once the principal even asked him to meet with the day laborers on campus in order to instruct them and inspire them to better service. Carver was also encouraged to put his methods in writing for the use of others. His ideas were outlined in several nature study leaflets, which gave simple instructions for teaching nature study courses in rural schools. In the beginning, the first leaflet stated, every teacher should realize that a very large proportion of every true student's work must be outside of the classroom. Describing his group method, Carver gave many practical exercises to get the students to observe their surroundings and to think for themselves. In 1910, he again incorporated his ideas in a bulletin, Nature Study and Gardening for Rural Schools. He preached that a garden should be connected with every school and that every child should be involved in the study of nature or agriculture. He declared nature study is agriculture and agriculture is nature study, if properly taught. Learning about plants and how to cultivate them was valuable for everyone, Carver declared, for even if the child does not become an agriculturalist or a farmer, these things all have the tendency to make a child think, and that's what we're trying to teach him, to think. Carver often stressed that teachers had a duty to take a personal interest in students, especially those who seem rather dull and are from any cause behind in their studies. Practicing what he preached, his interest extended far beyond the classroom and included all students, not merely those in agriculture. He lived in one of the boys' dormitories, Rockefeller Hall, and that made him accessible to all male students in curriculums from printing to plumbing. Many availed themselves of this opportunity, and they found Carver a warm and willing listener to their problems. His advice was given with so much love, understanding, and humor that it was long remembered by students. Some of his advice is up there on the exhibit, I noticed. Ask about marriage, he would tell the boys to get yourself a bird cage before you take unto yourself a canary. At the core of his advice, however, was his admonition to be as wise as a serpent and as harmless as a dove. He tried to get his children, as he called them, to learn to respect themselves and others. He told each to become a person who neither looks up to the rich nor down on the poor, and who takes his share of the world and lets other people have theirs. Self-respect requires living up to one's potential, and Carver employed a number of devices to encourage students to do their best. His love and faith in them were powerful influences, but he also used wit to break down barriers to self-fulfillment. Constantly teasing them about being worthless, he often hinted that he might be forced to take drastic action if they did not improve. His children frequently were handicapped by poverty and discrimination, but Carver believed that limited visions and narrow horizons were seriously restricting and could be more easily changed. He wanted students to look beyond the known and to seek new answers to old problems. This old notion, Carver wrote, of swallowing down other people's ideas and problems just as they have worked them out, without putting our brains and originality into it and making them applicable to our specific needs, must go. And the sooner we let go, the sooner we will become a free and independent people. Espousing Booker T. Washington's doctrine that achievement helped to bring acceptance, Carver constantly urged young blacks to do the common things in an uncommon way. He lamented the fact that too few African Americans had made themselves important economic and social forces in society and encouraged them to change that condition, declaring, "We must get hold of the soil and work ourselves into an indispensable part and parcel of this great body politic. At the present time, we are too parasitic. If we should drop out of existence, the world would not be sufficiently jarred to cause much of a tremor. We must change that, so that if such a jar should come upon us, the whole world would feel it and suffer accordingly." Carver realized that many obstacles to black success resulted from white racism and not black weakness, but he warned his students not to use that as an excuse for failure. In 1908, he wrote, "In these strenuous times, we are likely to become morbid and look constantly upon the dark side of life, and spend entirely too much time considering and brooding over what we can't do rather than what we can do. And instead of growing morose and despondent over opportunities, either real or imaginary, that are shut from us, let us rejoice at the many unexplored fields in which there is unlimited fame and fortune to the successful explorer, and upon which there is no color line, simply the survival of the fittest." Significantly, the article urged African Americans to engage in plant breeding to develop improved species. Carver's own success in this field made him optimistic. If African Americans were directed to explore the unknown, they could win the so-called Darwinian struggle for survival. Carver was a dreamer and an idealist. Although confrontation with the harsh realities of racism later dimmed his optimism, he could never entirely shed his faith in a just universe. Such a belief was central to his religion, and it was this vision and faith that Carver sought most earnestly to impart to his children. His was a joyous religion of love that went far beyond the Protestant work ethic or the fear of eternal damnation. As a result, students who had previously found religion repressive sought out Carver for Bible discussions. Carver's Sunday evening Bible class grew out of this student enthusiasm. In February of 1907, 7 students asked Carver to help them organize a Bible class to be held during a 35-minute break between Sunday supper and evening chapel services. When the first meeting convened in a room in a library, about 50 students came to hear Professor Carver discuss the creation story. The creation was explained in the light of natural and revealed religion and geological truths, using maps, charts, plants, and geological specimens as illustrations. 3 months later, the attendance had climbed to over 100 and continued to grow during the 30 years Carver taught the class. Despite the fact that students at Tuskegee had very little free time and were already required to attend several religious services on Sunday, many boys began rushing through supper in order to get good seats for Carver's voluntary Bible class. One student who had reluctantly attended his first class later recalled that upon entering the room, smiling faces created an atmosphere of welcome, and for the first time in my life, I was witnessing no gloom surrounding the Bible. I began to feel as I had back home when we went to a candy pulling party, happy that I had come. Perhaps this happy feeling that I now had would leave, and fear and gloom descend on me again as soon as the discussion of the Bible started. Well, fear and gloom were not part of Carver's religion. He spoke of a beneficent Creator who sought happiness in this life to those who attuned themselves to his messages. Students were puzzled by Carver's failure to mention God and asked the professor if the Creator was the same as God. He assured them that God and the Creator are one and the same, and explained, "Our Creator is the same and never changes, despite the names given him by people here and in all parts of the world. Even if we gave him no name at all, he would still be there within us, waiting to give us good on this earth." Carver's Creator could not be limited or circumscribed by man's labels. Neither could he be threatened by the discoveries of science. To Carver, there was no conflict between religion and science. Indeed, the Creator revealed himself in his creations, and the more one learned about the universe, the more clearly one could perceive the Creator. If Carver's Creator was different from the old man in the sky of his students' previous religious training, his explanations of heaven and hell were especially enlightening to young men raised on fire and brimstone. He said, "When our thoughts, which bring actions, are filled with hate against anyone, Negro or white, we are in a living hell. That is as real as hell will ever be. While hate for our fellow man puts us in a living hell, holding good thoughts for them gives us an opposite state of living, one of happiness, success, peace. We are then in heaven." To Carver, the Creator was good, and evil was the result of people's failure to open themselves to this good. Evil was human beings' creation. Goodness and love were God's. Therefore, love was a more powerful force than hate. Such a philosophy was central to Carver's approach to racism. To return hate with hate seemed to Carver only to compound the problem and make the solution more difficult. For this reason, and not because he accepted Southern racial etiquette, Carver persistently refused to express bitterness towards the white South. When his Bible students confronted him with statistics of racial hate and violence, Carver responded with the story of David and Goliath to illustrate the power of love to vanquish hate. He said, fear of something is at the root of hate for others. And hate will eventually destroy the hater. Keep your thoughts free from hate, and you will have no fear from those who hate you. David, though small, was filled with truth, right thinking, and goodwill for others. Goliath represents one who let fear into his heart, and it stayed there long enough to grow into hate for others. Undoubtedly, Carver was an idealistic dreamer whose optimistic faith sometimes put him out of touch with reality, both in the field of race relations and the economic possibilities of some Southern resources, like peanuts. Yet to African Americans grappling with the bleak conditions of the era called the nadir of the black experience, Carver offered a spark of hope and a reason to continue the struggle. To a large number of students, Carver gave more than inspiration. Many students might never have completed their studies at Tuskegee without the aid of loans he either made personally or co-signed for them. Carver spent little money on himself. He preferred to wear old clothes, and he made many of the articles he needed from waste products and natural resources, so that he constantly had a good reserve of cash on hand. And with this reserve, he preferred to make loans rather than gifts to students. That way the money went further and it didn't sap the initiative of the students. But he frequently made small monetary donations to those that he felt needed such help. A student's graduation did not mean the end of Carver's help and support. His children continued to turn to him for financial help. One asked Father to talk to Santa Claus about a uniform he needed for his new school. Another wrote Carver that he had passed the state exams and was ready to practice medicine, but that he needed an instrument for reading blood pressure. More important than direct financial aid, however, were Carver's efforts to get students good jobs or further education. He operated to some degree as a one-man employment bureau, using his contacts throughout the South to obtain positions for worthy students. For the brighter students, he sought to secure scholarships to allow them to get a college education and directed several students, incidentally, here to Iowa State. In addition to such aid, Carver continued to advise and inspire students after their departure from Tuskegee. He encouraged his children to keep in touch through correspondence, and those who wrote Carver soon learned that they would receive prompt responses from the professor. Despite the many, many demands in his time, he always found the time to pen a personal reply to all letters from students. It was not unusual for Tuskegee faculty to urge former students to report their successes and problems, and many students Washington and other teachers. Student letters to Carver, however, reveal a very special relationship. Carver obviously embodied the warmth and love of parenthood more than authority. Many of the other faculty members became kind of surrogate parents, but Carver's was a particularly warm relationship. He said, one Puerto Rican student wrote, "I have not forgotten you because I remember the many times you played with me and made my life while in Tuskegee happy." And he closed the letter with, "Goodbye, old top." Another student, whom Carver had encouraged to go to Iowa State, opened his letter from this campus with the salutation, "Hello, Prof," and declared, "You see, I'm pretty near being a scientist myself, and as I have always had a hankering for being familiar with great folks, I take this liberty in addressing you. Look out, I'll be calling you George first thing you know." Another student, writing his intention of coming to a farmers' conference, told Carver he planned to bring a gang and sit in a position facing you so I can make faces at you. Since he was bringing his wife along, he wrote, he intended to be dignified if possible, but he warned Carver, "If you start anything, my gang will take care of you." Even the respect students felt for Carver's genius was tempered by affection and warmth. In a letter to the professor, one student declared his ambition. With all my boasting of you, I must be frank and tell you that you are a most discouraging fellow. You see, while at Tuskegee, we were constantly urged to pick out some great soul whom we should strive to emulate. Unfortunately for me, I picked you out and have been working my head off to get somewhere in sight of you. But every time I round a big bend and get a glimpse of your coattail, nothing possesses you but to double your speed and finally emerge at the peak of some distant, inaccessible mountain. Now, young man, I'm getting good and tired of it. And if you want me to follow you any further, you'll just have to slow down to some reasonable pace, that's all. Many letters mention spankings, beatings, or thrashings. One wrote, "I suppose you really and truly feel like giving me a good spanking. Well, your used-to-be boy is now at home with his wife and feels it would take a pretty good man to handle him now." What such letters referred to was Carver's constant threats to beat his bad boys, and he occasionally administered mock thrashings by gently scuffling with his children. For many Tuskegee students, Carver's obvious love and interest instilled self-confidence and spurred them to greater achievements. Carver's magic extended beyond the Tuskegee classroom. He not only inspired the young black males of Tuskegee, but he also inspired young older men and whites. Under Carver's leadership, Tuskegee established numerous extension activities to reach the older farmers who could not attend school full-time. Carver was apparently also seductive to older audiences, those who participated in such extension efforts as yearly farmers' conferences, fairs, agricultural institutes, short courses on agriculture, and the Jessup Wagon, a movable school that went out to the farmers' fields. Through such efforts, as well as through his research at the Tuskegee Agricultural Experiment Station and his agricultural bulletins, Carver did not single-handedly remake Southern agriculture, but he did improve the lives of hundreds of poor, landless sharecroppers by making education common. Indeed, I wish I could speak more on the extension activities of Carver, because he was very creative and painstaking in trying to reach the people who needed help the most, or the man furthest down, as he referred to them. In addition, after his rise to fame, Carver was sent on tours of white college campuses by the YMCA and the Commission on Interracial Cooperation. And they were using him in their efforts to improve race relations. And on these tours, Carver acquired some new children, some white children, and his family then became biracial. Carver's influence in these campus tours went far beyond the average chapel or assembly speaker for a number of reasons. First, he insisted in settings that in which he could have personal contact with the students. "Please make it clear," he wrote regarding one tour, "that we prefer to meet with the students rather than a small group of the elite at a dinner engagement." In addition, he truly liked young people and could effectively communicate his affection and interest in them. To be sure, they respected and admired Carver, but they also liked him. He was not merely a hero figure or a token black. He was a friend with whom they felt at ease. Their letters reflect the absence of barriers in their relationship with Carver. They poured out their most secret and personal problems and fears, knowing they could be heard sympathetically, just as Carver's black children had been. One white boy even admitted that he had contracted syphilis to Carver. That's how personal their letters got. They also felt free to tease the famous scientist, often poking fun at both his inventiveness and his saintliness. For example, one declared, "I believe if you were marooned on a desert island, you would be busy teaching the fish to swim better, or making vanilla ice cream out of sand spurs. It's a good thing you have peanuts, sweet potatoes, etc. to work with. Otherwise, you would certainly be in more mischief than a half-grown puppy." Another wrote in mock anger, declaring his intention to provoke Carver to soil his saintly lips by murmuring damn and hell. Those who traveled with Carver had especially fond remembrances. On most of the tours he made in the late 1920s and 1930s, Carver was accompanied by young whites. This arrangement eased some of the burdens of travel, but it created special problems. All travel had to be by automobile, and the cars were not always reliable. One participant wrote, "We have trusted ourselves to old automobiles in some situations in which it seemed our only hope lay in your extracting some gasoline from nearby vegetation." Another difficulty was getting something to eat along the way. The solution was picnic lunches that usually ended in nature lessons by Carver. On one occasion, a pond was nearby, and the 70-year-old scientist joined his young colleagues in swimming and the splashing that inevitably followed. Often the schedule was too hectic to allow stopping to eat at all. And one participant later reminded Carver of our sandwich lunches in the Buick at 50 miles per hour, Jim driving, swinging the old steering wheel right and left, you yelling for sardine sandwiches and me struggling in the back seat trying to spread the butter. These trips forged bonds of friendship that went beyond mere respect for Carver's genius. Traveling with an African American also provided his boys with first-hand knowledge of discrimination, making them aware, as one noted, of the many doors that neither you nor any member of your race could enter. Friendship with Carver not only opened their eyes to discrimination,